The 12 days leading up to Alexander the Great's death are a terrifying, bewildering enigma, a period where history itself seems to lose its footing and plunge into shadow. On June 10th or 11th, 323 BC, in the ancient city of Babylon, the man who had conquered the known world, who had led his armies to the edges of the earth, who was revered as a god, lay dying. But how and why? This wasn't a sudden death in battle, a hero's fall. This was a slow, agonizing descent into oblivion, shrouded in such conflicting accounts and political intrigue that even 2,300 years later, the truth remains tantalizingly out of reach, leaving historians with an unraveling mystery that defies logical explanation. Alexander had lived a life of relentless motion, a whirlwind of ambition and conquest. From his youth, tutored by Aristotle, he was destined for greatness, not merely to inherit a kingdom, but to forge an empire unlike any seen before. His campaign stretched from Macedon across Persia through Egypt and into India, a tireless march of victory after victory. He was a brilliant strategist, a charismatic leader who fought alongside his men, sustaining numerous wounds but never falling. His energy seemed boundless, his will indomitable. He had just returned to Babylon, the heart of his sprawling new empire, after years of campaigning. He was only 32 years old. This was not a man expected to simply fade away. Babylon itself was a city of omens, a place of breathtaking grandeur. Its hanging gardens and ziggurats rose like ancient wonders. But it was also steeped in a sense of foreboding for the Macedonians. The Chaldeans, its resident priests and astrologers, had warned Alexander against entering the city from the east, an ill-fated direction. They urged him to avoid Babylon entirely, or at least to delay his entry, perform certain rites, and even rebuild the tomb of Belus, which he had begun to do. But Alexander, with his usual blend of arrogance and ambition, found ways to circumvent these warnings, often through clever interpretations or by simply ignoring them. He saw himself above such superstitions, a man favored by the gods, perhaps even a god himself. Yet the air was thick with unease. The immediate cause, or at least the catalyst for his illness, appears to have been a night of excessive feasting and drinking. Accounts vary wildly in their details, but they all agree on one thing. Alexander, never one to shy away from indulgence, participated in a prolonged banquet. It was a common occurrence for him, these bouts of revelry with his companions, often lasting through the night. He was known for his legendary capacity for alcohol, part of the persona of a larger-than-life conqueror. But this time, something was different. After a particularly long drinking session, possibly at the house of his friend Medius of Larissa, he developed a sudden, acute fever. The first day, according to the royal diaries, began simply enough. Alexander was experiencing a fever, but he dismissed it as a minor ailment, perhaps the result of overindulgence. He bathed, performed his usual sacrifices to the gods, and even played dice with Medius. He was still giving orders, still planning future campaigns, the conquest of Arabia, the circumnavigation of Africa. His mind was sharp, his ambition undimmed, even as his body began to betray him. But the fever persisted, gnawing at his strength, a relentless internal fire that would not be quenched by cold baths or the passing of a day. This was not a man accustomed to weakness, and his initial reaction was to simply power through it, as he had so many times before. By the second and third days, the fever had worsened considerably. The initial fatigue deepened into profound exhaustion. He was still able to give instructions to his generals, discussing troop movements and naval preparations for the Arabian expedition, but the effort clearly took its toll. The atmosphere in the palace grew tense. This was not the robust, invincible king they knew. The physicians, initially confident, now moved with a growing sense of urgency, their faces etched with concern. They administered remedies, traditional Macedonian and Egyptian concoctions, but nothing seemed to touch the fever. His body, once a finely tuned instrument of war, was beginning to fail, unresponsive to the will that had commanded empires. As the days bled into each other, Alexander's condition deteriorated rapidly. The fever raged, his body becoming a furnace. He began experiencing sharp pains, possibly in his abdomen or limbs, and a growing difficulty in breathing. The royal diaries, our primary source, become increasingly sparse in their details about his symptoms, almost as if the scribes, fearful or bewildered, struggled to record the terrifying reality unfolding before them. What exactly was happening to Alexander? Was this the natural progression of a virulent disease or something far more sinister at play? A deliberate act shrouded in the chaos of his dying moments. The palace, once a hub of grand strategy and lively debate, transformed into a hushed chamber of dread. His closest companions, the companions and bodyguards, began to realize the gravity of the situation. They were men who had served him for years, who had seen him miraculously survive countless battles, but this unseen enemy was different. They consulted the oracles, desperate for divine intervention, sending messages to the temple of Serapis to ask if Alexander should be moved. The oracle's reply was chilling. It would be better for Alexander to remain where he was. In other words, he was already beyond mortal help. On the seventh day, Alexander was so weak he could no longer rise from his bed without assistance. He continued, heroically, to offer his hand to his commanders as they filed past, a final gesture of connection to the army he loved and commanded. But his voice, once booming and commanding, was now a whisper, his words barely audible. The very act of recognition, a simple handshake, became an agonizing effort. Imagine the faces of those hardened veterans seeing their god-king reduced to this state. A man who had never shown fear or weakness, now consumed by an invisible illness. The raw emotion must have been palpable in that room. The news of Alexander's declining health could no longer be contained within the palace walls. Rumors began to spread like wildfire through Babylon. Their king was dying. Panic rippled through the army. Could it be true? The soldiers, fiercely loyal and deeply superstitious, demanded to see their leader. They feared he had already died, or worse, that his generals were concealing his death to seize power. What would become of them, of this vast empire, without its central sun? This is where the story takes a turn towards the deeply human and tragic. The soldiers, thousands strong, forced their way into the palace. They were not rebelling, they were grieving, desperate for a glimpse of their king, perhaps to reassure themselves he was still alive, or to say a final goodbye. Alexander, barely conscious, was propped up on his couch. As the long line of battle-hardened Macedonian veterans filed past him, one by one, he struggled to lift his head, to wave a hand, to acknowledge each man. He could no longer speak, but his eyes, clear and steady despite his suffering, met theirs. It was a silent farewell, a profound moment of shared humanity between a dying god and his mortal followers. The 11th day. Alexander had lost the power of speech entirely. He communicated only with gestures, his mind perhaps still sharp, trapped within a failing body. The palace was filled with the quiet desperation of his inner circle.
His most trusted generals, the Diadochi, men like Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Cassander, and Lysimachus, gathered around his deathbed. The greatest empire the world had ever seen was about to lose its architect. And the question of succession, of who would inherit this impossible legacy, hung heavy in the air, unspoken but understood by all. This silence, punctuated only by his labored breathing, must have been suffocating. In his final moments, when asked to whom he bequeathed his empire, Alexander famously, or perhaps apocryphically, whispered, "To the strongest." Or perhaps he said, "To Craterus, a general who was not present." The accounts differ, adding another layer to the enigma. What is certain is that he pointed towards Perdiccas, one of his most loyal generals, and gave him his signet ring, the ultimate symbol of royal authority. This single gesture, or word, would plunge the empire into decades of brutal civil war, the Wars of the Diadochi, as his generals tore apart what he had so painstakingly built. This was the final act of a man who had always sought to control destiny, now losing his grip. His last command sowing the seeds of endless conflict. On the 12th day, June 10th or 11th, 323 BC, Alexander the Great died. The specific date is still debated, as are the exact circumstances. His body, some accounts say, remained uncorrupted for several days, leading to further speculation about his divine nature, or, more chillingly, that he was not truly dead when first declared so, merely in a deep coma. Imagine the chaos, the grief, the fear that erupted in Babylon upon the official announcement. The architect of the Hellenistic world, the invincible king, was gone. His death marked not just the end of a man, but the end of an era, a paradigm shift for the entire ancient world. So, what truly killed Alexander the Great? This is where the medical and historical detectives step in, sifting through the sparse, often contradictory ancient texts. The theories are numerous, each with its own compelling arguments, and each leaving critical questions unanswered. Was it a natural illness, a swift, brutal attack by disease on a body weakened by years of campaigning and indulgence? Or was it something far more premeditated, a quiet assassination carried out by those closest to him, eager to seize the reins of power? One prominent theory is that Alexander succumbed to malaria or typhoid fever. These diseases were rampant in the ancient world, especially in marshy, hot climates like Babylon. The symptoms described, high fever, extreme exhaustion, abdominal pain, loss of speech, are consistent with both. Malaria, with its cyclical fevers and debilitating effects, could certainly explain a prolonged illness. Typhoid, caused by contaminated food or water, could lead to a slow decline, particularly if complicated by intestinal perforation. Both diseases would have been beyond the understanding and capabilities of ancient physicians to treat effectively. His history of frequent bathing in the cold Euphrates could have exacerbated a weakened immune system, making him more susceptible. Another medical hypothesis suggests pancreatitis, an inflammation of the pancreas, often triggered by excess alcohol and rich foods. This would explain the severe abdominal pain and rapid deterioration. Or perhaps West Nile virus, a mosquito-borne illness, which could also present with fever, neurological symptoms, and a prolonged course. Some even suggest acute gastroenteritis, pneumonia, or pleurisy, complications that could arise from a weakened state. The problem with all these natural cause theories is that while the symptoms generally align, the suddenness of the onset and the very specific 12-day timeline, along with the profound political implications, make many historians skeptical of a simple illness. The mystery endures precisely because the evidence is ambiguous enough to allow for other, darker interpretations.
This brings us to the most sensational and enduring theory: poisoning. Who would dare to poison the mighty Alexander, and why? This theory gains traction from the sheer number of people who stood to gain from his death and the desperate political maneuvering that immediately followed. Alexander had become increasingly autocratic in his later years, alienating some of his most trusted generals and advisors. He had executed several prominent figures for real or perceived conspiracies, including Parmenion and his son Philotas, and had even killed his loyal companion Cletus the Black in a drunken rage. The fear of Alexander was growing, even among those closest to him.
One primary suspect for poisoning is Antipater, the regent of Macedon, Alexander's homeland. Alexander had grown increasingly distrustful of Antipater, suspecting him of mismanagement and even rebellion. He had ordered Antipater to return to Babylon, effectively summoning him to his judgment, while Antipater's son, Cassander, had already been treated harshly by Alexander. It's plausible that Antipater, fearing for his life and position, might have orchestrated Alexander's death. The method? A slow-acting poison, one that would mimic natural illness, allowing him to slowly waste away without suspicion. Ancient sources like Plutarch and Arrian hint at such a conspiracy, often citing an account by Olympias, Alexander's mother, who strongly believed he was poisoned. The physician Philip of Acarnania was once suspected of attempting to poison Alexander, and Alexander survived only because his friend Parmenion warned him. This shows the idea of poisoning was not foreign to Alexander's court. The specific poison mentioned in some accounts was hellebore, a toxic plant that could induce prolonged illness and death, with symptoms somewhat consistent with Alexander's final days. Another theory suggests a slow-acting poison derived from water hemlock, which can also cause prolonged suffering. If you had to pick a side, what explanation resonates more with you? A natural, tragic end, or a meticulously planned assassination? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to hear your interpretations. The political machinations surrounding his death are perhaps even more compelling than the medical details. With Alexander gone, the vast empire he had built was suddenly a vacuum. His generals, the Diadochi, were all ambitious men with significant armies and territories under their command. They had been chafing under Alexander's increasing despotism and his adoption of Persian customs. His death released them from his iron grip, allowing them to carve out their own kingdoms. The speed with which they began to fight amongst themselves for control lends credence to the idea that some of them might have desired his removal. The sudden, shocking nature of his decline, coupled with the convenient absence of certain key figures and the immediate scramble for power, feeds the poisoning narrative. The royal diaries themselves, supposedly a day-by-day account, are suspiciously brief and vague during his illness. Some historians suspect these diaries were later edited or even fabricated by Alexander's generals to conceal the true cause of his death or to present a sanitized version of events. If a slow-acting poison was administered, it would have been nearly impossible for ancient doctors to detect, making it the perfect crime. Another intriguing detail: after Alexander's death, his body remained unburied for an astonishing amount of time. Accounts vary from a few days to over a week or even longer, while his generals debated the succession and the logistics of his funeral. Some ancient sources claim his body showed no signs of decomposition during this period, leading to the legend that he was divine or that the decomposition was unnaturally slow.
Modern scholars, however, suggest that if he truly was poisoned with certain substances, or if he was in a comatose state when declared dead, the initial lack of decomposition could be explained. This lingering anomaly adds yet another layer to the baffling circumstances of his final hours. The immediate aftermath of Alexander's death was a brutal power struggle. There was no clear successor. His half-brother, Philip III Aridaeus, was mentally unstable, and his unborn son with Roxanne, Alexander IV, was an infant. The empire was immediately plunged into the Wars of the Diadochi, a series of conflicts that lasted for over 40 years, ultimately tearing the empire into several Hellenistic kingdoms ruled by Alexander's former generals. This fragmentation, this almost immediate collapse of his grand vision, makes one wonder if some of these generals had been anticipating, perhaps even facilitating, his demise. The legacy of Alexander's death is not just about the man, but about the world he left behind. His conquests had reshaped the geopolitical landscape, spreading Greek culture, language, and influence across a vast swathe of Afro-Eurasia. The Hellenistic period, a direct consequence of his empire, saw unprecedented cultural fusion and intellectual flourishing. But this transformation began not with a grand decree from Alexander, but with the murky, unexplained circumstances of his death in a Babylonian palace. The unanswered questions continue to fuel academic debate, historical thrillers, and a persistent fascination with one of history's most enigmatic figures. What if Alexander had lived? What more could he have conquered? Would his empire have endured as a unified entity? The possibilities are endless and endlessly debated. His untimely death, regardless of its cause, solidified his legend, freezing him in time as the undefeated conqueror who died before he could ever truly grow old or suffer a major defeat. It allowed his myth to flourish unchecked by the challenges of governing a truly stable, long-lasting empire. He became the eternal young conqueror, the man who knew no bounds. Yet, amidst all the grand theories of poison and political conspiracy, there remains the unsettling human truth. Alexander was mortal after all. He was subject to the same frailties, the same diseases, the same inevitable end as any other man. His extraordinary life had perhaps masked this vulnerability, making his sudden, agonizing demise all the more shocking. He lived fast, fought hard, and died young, leaving behind an empire in chaos and a mystery that continues to haunt us. The 12 days of his final illness stripped away the veneer of divinity and invincibility, revealing a man suffering, helpless against an unseen foe. The truth of Alexander's death may forever remain one of history's great unsolved puzzles. The conflicting accounts, the politically charged environment, the primitive medical knowledge of the time all conspire to keep the definitive answer just beyond our grasp. We are left with fragments, whispers across millennia, trying to piece together the final hours of a man who changed the world. Did a fever claim him, or a hidden hand? Was it a tragic accident, or a meticulously executed plot? The very fact that we still debate these possibilities, that the evidence remains so tantalizingly open to interpretation, is a testament to the enduring power and mystique of Alexander the Great. His final days in Babylon serve as a profound reminder that even the mightiest conqueror is ultimately subject to the unpredictable currents of fate, whether natural or man-made. What do you think is the most plausible explanation for those bewildering 12 days? Share your theories in the comments, and if you're as fascinated by these ancient mysteries as I am, consider subscribing to the channel for more dives into the lives and deaths of history's most compelling figures.